If you've ever lived near a neighborhood managed by a homeowners association, you know they could be a special kind of headache. But imagine living right next to one while trying to run a century-old family ranch. And then imagine a woman who thinks your private acreage is her personal shortcut to the Starbucks drive-thru. Yeah, that was my life for 6 months, and honestly, if I hadn't lived through it, I'm not sure I believe how far some people will go to feel superior. My place is called Blackwood Creek, a little over 400 acres of rolling limestone hills, scrub oak, and some of the best grazing land in this part of Texas. Land that's been in my family since my great-grandfather decided he'd rather fight the heat and the rocks than live in a city. And for a long time, it was just me, the cattle, and the sound of the wind through the tall grass, until the, Oak Haven Estates, decided to sprout up right against my eastern fence line like a cluster of beige mushrooms after a heavy rain. These Warren and Oppos, just houses, they were, executive manor homes, which is just code for mansions that are way too big for their lots. And they brought with them a very specific type of person, the kind who moves to the country because they like the, aesthetic, but gets personally offended when they realize a working ranch actually involves dust, manure, and people who don an Oppos. Care about the latest neighborhood landscaping trends. And then there was Margaret Sterling. The first time I met her, I was out near the boundary line fixing a section of fence that a stubborn heifer had decided to test, and I heard the low, expensive hum of a turbo diesel engine that definitely didn't and Oppos belong in a pasture. I looked up to see this massive, metallic white Cadillac Escalade, the kind that looks like it's never seen a speck of dirt in its life, bouncing down my private access track, which I should clarify, ISN and Oppos. They rode it all. It's just two ruts in the dirt I use to move hay and check on the herd. Margaret rolled down the window, her designer sunglasses reflecting the Texas sun, and before I could even say hello, she barked out, "This road is terrible. You really need to have the HOA pave this. It's vibrating my steering wheel." I just stood there for a second, wiping the grease off my hand with a rag, and I told her as politely as I could, "Ma and Oppos, this ISN and Oppos, and HOA road, this is my private ranch, and you're about a quarter mile past the property line. You need to turn that thing around and head back to the paved cul-de-sac." She gave me this look, this absolute look of pure, unadulterated disdain, and she scoffed, "My GPS says this connects to the county highway, and I don an Oppos. Have time to go the long way around the development every morning. It adds 5 minutes to my commute, so I and Oppos. I'll just be using this from now on, thanks," and before I could even open my mouth to argue, she rolled that window up and sped off, kicking a cloud of dust right into my face. I thought it was a one-time thing, a misunderstanding, but over the next week, Margaret became a permanent fixture on my land. Every morning at 7:45 and every evening at 5:30, that white SUV would come tearing through my quiet sanctuary, spooking the calves and rutting up the ground. And it didn't in Oppos. Stopped with her soon. A couple of her neighbors started following her lead, treating my heritage as their personal bypass. I tried the neighborly route first. I really did. I went out and bought the biggest, brightest, private property, no trespassing, signs I could find and bolted them to heavy steel posts right where the pavement ended and my dirt began. But the very next morning, I found one of the signs bent flat to the ground and the other one missing entirely, later found tossed into the creek like it was trash. The turning point came when I tried to reason with the HOA president, a man named Arthur who looked like he'd never spent a day outside without SPF 50, and he just smiled at me over his mahogany desk and said, Now, let's be reasonable, Mr. Blackwood. The residents feel that since your land is just sitting there, it shouldn't into Oppos. Be an issue for a few cars to pass through. It's the neighborly thing to do, after all, and we'd hate for there to be any and Oppos, tension and Oppos, between the estate and your little farm, and, little farm. That's when the heat started rising in my chest, because this wasn't Oppos. Just about a shortcut anymore. It was about the fact that these people felt they had a right to what my family had bled for, just because it was convenient for them. I called the sheriff, a guy I've known since we were kids, and he came out and shook his head, telling me, "Look, I can cite them if I catch them in the act, but Margaret is claiming there's an Oppos, implied easement and oppos because the track has been there so long, and unless you put up a gate or a wall, it's a civil matter, and the courts are backed up for months, end quote. That night, I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and I realized that being and, quote, neighborly, end quote, was getting me nowhere. If Margaret wanted to treat my ranch like a highway, then I was going to give her a highway she'd never forget. I spent the next 2 days in the barn and on the phone with my lawyer, a sharp woman who knows property law like the back of her hand, and she told me, end quote, you can't hurt anyone, and you can't trap them, but you have every right to perform an oppos, land management and agricultural improvements in oppos, on your own soil. Just make sure you document every single warning you give them, end quote. So I went to work. Step 1 was the signage. I didn't an oppos. T just put up one sign. I put up a gauntlet of them, big, reflective boards that said, end quote, danger, active land management, end quote, uneven terrain ahead, end quote, and end quote, not a public thoroughfare, proceed at own risk, end quote, all dated and photographed. Then I brought out the heavy machinery. I hooked up the subsoiler to my biggest tractor. This thing has steel shanks designed to break up hard-packed clay 3 feet deep. And I didn't in oppos. T just K the road. I turned it into a corrugated nightmare. I created deep, rhythmic swells in the earth that looked okay from a distance, but would vibrate the teeth out of anyone trying to go faster than 5 miles an hour. But I wasn't in oppos, T done. I moved several large, jagged limestone boulders, natural erosion control, of course, and placed them strategically along the edges and in the end quote, blind end quote, spots of the ruts, just high enough to clear a tractor tire, but low enough to catch the plastic oil pan of a luxury SUV. The piece de resistance, though, was the end quote, irrigation project, end quote. I noticed a low spot where the rain naturally pooled, so I dug it out a bit deeper and end quote, accidentally end quote, left a water trough running nearby for a few hours. It turned that section into a soup of thick black gumbo mud that looked like a shallow puddle on top, but had the consistency of quicksand underneath. And for the final touch, I spread a fresh, steaming load of manure from the holding pens across the entire 50-foot stretch leading up to the mud hole. I wanted the experience to be sensory in every possible way. Thursday morning arrived, and I was sitting in the cab of my old Ford truck, hidden behind a thicket of oaks with my binoculars, and right on schedule, the white Escalade appeared, pausing for just a second at the first sign before Margaret, in her infinite arrogance, floored it. She hit the subsoiled section first, and I could see the entire vehicle start to buck like a bronco, her head snapping back and forth as the end quote, executive suspension end quote, tried and failed to handle the rhythmic thumping of the deep-tilled earth, and I could hear the engine roaring as she tried to power through it, probably screaming at her steering wheel the whole time. She reached the end quote, rock garden end quote, next, and as she tried to swerve to avoid a particularly deep rut, I heard it. The sickening metallic crunch of limestone meeting expensive German-engineered undercarriage, and I knew she'd just ripped the plastic shielding right off the bottom of that car. But she didn't in oppos. T stop. God, she was stubborn. She hit the manure-covered stretch, the tires flinging the end quote, organic fertilizer end quote, high into the air, coating the white paint in a layer of brown filth, and then she hit the mud hole. She didn't in oppos. T even have a chance. The heavy front end of that Cadillac dove into the gumbo, and as the wheels started to spin, they just dug her deeper and deeper until the frame was resting on the ground and the tires were nothing but spinning slicks of black slime. I waited a few minutes, letting the silence of the ranch settle back in, before I slowly drove my truck down the hill and pulled up about 20 yards away. Margaret had climbed out of the driver's side, and she was standing there in her expensive heels, sinking up to her ankles in a mixture of mud and manure, her face a shade of purple I've only ever seen on a ripe plum. End quote. You, end quote, she shrieked, pointing a finger at me while she tried to wipe a splat of mud off her designer jacket. End quote. You did this. You sabotaged this road. I'm calling the police. I'm suing you for every cent this ranch is worth. Look at my car. End quote. I just leaned my elbow out the window, tipped my hat, and said, end quote, morning, Margaret. I'm not sure what you're talking about. I've been doing some essential soil, aeration, and erosion control this week. Didn't and oppos. Till you see the 5 different signs warning you about the hazardous terrain. I'd offer to pull you out, but my tractor is currently rigged for the Indapos, land management Indapos, and I wouldn't Indapos. Do you want to cause any more Indapos, tension Indapos, between us neighbors, end quote. The sheriff arrived about 30 minutes later, and I almost felt bad for him having to listen to her scream, but he just looked at the signs, looked at her car buried to the axles, and then looked at her muddy shoes and shrugged. End quote. Mon Appos. End quote. He said, trying to hide a smirk, end quote. He's got the warnings posted, and you're nearly half a mile onto his private property. From where I'm standing, you drove a city car into a construction zone on land you don and Appos. Tion. So the only thing I can do is write you a trespassing citation and wait for the tow truck. End quote. It took 2 hours and a heavy-duty winch to get that SUV out of the muck, and the sound of her bumper snapping as they dragged it backward was the most beautiful music I'd heard in years. The HOA tried to send me a, end quote, cease and desist, end quote, letter a week later, but my lawyer responded with a bill for the, end quote, damage to my agricultural soil, end quote, and a copy of the trail camera footage showing Margaret intentionally running over my signs, and suddenly, the HOA president became very, very quiet. Margaret still lives in Oak Haven, but she doesn't in Appos to use the shortcut anymore. In fact, I heard she had to sell the Escalade because the smell of the manure had permeated the air conditioning vents and no amount of detailing could get it out. The ranch is quiet again. The cattle are grazing in peace, and the track is grown over with thick, thorny blackberry bushes that I planted right at the property line, just in case anyone else gets the itch to save 5 minutes on their morning commute. I know some people might say I went too far, that I should have just kept calling the cops or waited for the courts, but out here, the land is all you have, and if you don an Appos, to protect it, nobody else will. But what about you? If someone was treating your home like their personal hallway and laughing in your face about it, would you have played it by the book, or would you have started digging a hole of your own? I'd love to hear if I was the, end quote, jerk, end quote, in this situation, or if Margaret finally got the Texas education she deserved. Drop a comment below and let me know whose side you're on, and if you got a story of your own about a neighbor who didn't end Appos. Do you know the meaning of the word Appos? Private and Appos. Ein Appos. Am all ears.